Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, Women Impressionists, Cassatt and Berthe Morisot. My name is Felicity, and I am from the Audience Engagement team here at the NGV and will be your host for today's presentation. Ordinarily, we would begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, and recognise the Wurundjeri Wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV is built. However, as we are coming to you remotely today, I would also like to acknowledge that many other people present in today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians and pay respect to those communities wherever they are as well. Our speaker today is Meg Slater, who is the Assistant Curator of International Exhibition Projects at the NGV. We're so pleased to have Meg join us today, and over to you, Meg.
Thanks so much, Felicity. Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I am working today, the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations. And I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be listening today. As Felicity mentioned, my name is Meg Slater. I am the Assistant Curator of International Exhibitions at the NGV. I was very lucky to be a part of the curatorial team that developed French Impressionism from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the 17th Melbourne Winter Masterpieces exhibition presented by the NGV. I worked alongside Miranda Wallace and Ted Gott here at the NGV, and of course, the exhibition curators from the MFA Boston, Katie Hansen and Julia Welch. So French Impressionism presents 114 artworks, all drawn from the impressive holdings of the MFA Boston. And these important loans from the MFA's collection of French Impressionist paintings provide a rare opportunity to see a significant grouping of masterworks by central members of the revolutionary artistic movement in Australia. The artworks assembled for French Impressionism have been divided into 10 thematic and loosely chronological sections, which together trace the development of the Impressionist movement in France, from the work of the Impressionists' forebears, artists collectively known as the Barbizon School, through to Impressionism's high point in the 1870s. Quotations gathered during the curatorial research process can be found throughout the exhibition, both directly on the gallery walls and on many artwork labels. We included these to highlight the connections between these artists, as well as their aims, motivations, challenges, insecurities, collaborations, and occasionally rivalries. So for today, I will be speaking about two women who were central members of the Impressionist circle, Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot, both of whom are represented in French Impressionism. During this lecture, I will introduce you to these two formative artists, their contributions to the Impressionist movement, the social and political context in which they worked and lived, and the legacy they leave both on and beyond the canvas. So on the next slide, we will see one single image, which takes us back to 1870s Paris, when the term Impressionism appeared in text for the first time on the 25th of April, 1874. Writing for the French magazine Le Charivari, apologies for any mispronunciations over the course of this lecture, critic and playwright Louis Leroy satirically responded to Claude Monet's 1872 canvas, Impression Sunrise, which you can see pictured on this slide. Leroy accused Monet of having created a sketch, a mere impression, rather than a resolved painting. Taken aback by Monet's broken brushwork and lightened palette, Leroy claimed that, and I quote, "Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." Ironically, Leroy's sentiments represent the central aim of the Impressionists, to capture the everyday and the ephemeral. Now, although this may seem like an uncontroversial approach to making art now, in the late 19th century, it represented a rebellion against the artistic order. According to critic and writer Camille Mauclair, Impressionism rejected every general truth in favor of the momentary aspect. This shift in focus, away from drawing, design, symbolism, and the primacy of the idea, posed a significant threat to the artistic establishment. Beyond the stylistic differences that resulted from the Impressionists choosing to paint en plein air, outdoors, and directly from nature, versus the tradition of painting in the studio and in great detail, the Impressionists rejected the rigidity and conservatism of the Salon system. And the Salon was a predominantly annual official art exhibition organized by the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. The Impressionists were unified by their independence from the Salon. After being repeatedly ridiculed and rejected from the state-sanctioned exhibition, these artists mounted 8 of their own independent exhibitions from 1874 until 1886, which offered participants the autonomy to display a much wider variety of work. Impressionism's founding members included Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, and Berthe Morisot. The group's composition changed over time, with new members joining and others leaving. In 1879, the American-born Mary Cassatt joined the group of independent artists and went on to display with the group several times before the final Impressionist exhibition in 1886. So on the next slide, you will see images of Morisot and Cassatt alongside images of 2 other women, who I will mention in a moment. Now, I think this context around Impressionism's beginnings and how it was initially received is important, because it emphasizes that despite being women at a time in history when women artists were not permitted to receive formal training and therefore did not have the same artistic and professional opportunities as their male counterparts, Morisot and Cassatt were embraced by the Impressionists and became central members of the group. Now, before discussing Morisot and Cassatt in more detail, I would like to acknowledge that they were not the only women Impressionists. Marie Braquemont and Eva Gonzalez, who you can see pictured on this slide, have their rightful place in the history of French Impressionism. However, this lecture draws on the networks and stories traced in French Impressionism from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, an exhibition which features the work of Morisot and Cassatt. So on the next slide, we will find some information about Morisot's life and the development of her artistic practice, which I will now go over now for you. So I thought I'd begin by discussing the artist who was the first woman to join the Impressionist circle. I will refer to several artworks representative of her broader artistic practice. One is in the MFA Boston's collection and is currently on display in French Impressionism, and the other was recently acquired for the NGV's permanent collection. But before discussing these remarkable works, I would like to take you through parts of Morisot's biography, particularly components that influenced and would eventually cement her position at the center of the Impressionist circle. So Morisot was born in 1841 in Bourges, a commune in France. In 1852, Morisot's family moved to the Rue du Moulin in Passy, a village eventually incorporated into Paris in 1860. Morisot was from a wealthy background, which afforded her the structures and systems she required to become a practicing artist from a very young age. She was from an affluent middle to upper class family. Her father was a high-ranking government official, and her grandfather was the influential Rococo painter Jean-Henri Fragonard. From a young age, Morisot and her sisters learned from private teachers, including Geoffrey Alphonse Chacun and Joseph Guichard, and also copied pictures from the National Collection in the Louvre. Morisot's parents also built her and her sister a studio in their garden in their Paris home. So with these supportive structures in place for Morisot from a young age, painting quickly became more than a leisure activity, which was the expectation for women who engaged in art making at this particular point in history. Morisot sought to become a professional artist, and this pursuit was supported by her mother, who encouraged Morisot to enter the art market and to professionalize. Now, for context, at this point in time, the state-sanctioned art school in Paris was inaccessible to all female students, and this restriction lasted until the end of the century. Beyond being barred from formal arts training, women were also limited in what they were permitted to study. For example, women were discouraged from painting the human form, particularly the nude, and condescending assumptions were often made about their preferred pictorial themes falling within the domestic realm. These kinds of assumptions neglected to acknowledge that women painters were unable to access many of the public spaces that their male peers frequented, including city streets, cafes, and other urban venues. These conditions, paired with the expectations associated with their gender, meant that women artists often depicted domestic and personal subjects, usually at the expense of urban themes. The freedom afforded to Morisot by virtue of her upbringing and her background did not preclude her from experiencing the sexism that barred women from official training at the time. Morisot's tutor, Guichard, went as far as to warn her mother about her daughter's interest in painting, potentially deterring her from her domestic duties. He said, and I quote, "Your daughters have such inclinations that my teaching will not give them the small talent of pleasing. They will become painters. Do you realize what that means? In your environment of the upper middle class, this will be a revolution. I might also say a catastrophe." Despite warnings such as those given by Guichard, Morisot continued to pursue her artistic career, and in 1864 had her work accepted into the state-sanctioned Salon exhibition. 5 years later, an important network was established, which would alter the course of Morisot's career. In 1869, Morisot was introduced to the Impressionist circle by Edouard Manet, who was her close friend, her mentor, and her eventual brother-in-law through her marriage to Eugene Manet. By the time the Impressionist group was formally constituted in December of 1873, Morisot was one of its core members. In 1874, she joined and participated in all but one of the 8 independent Impressionist exhibitions that would take place over the next 12 years. According to the curator and academic Sylvia Patry, Morisot's rejection of the artistic establishment was likely influenced by, and I quote, "the artistic universe favorable for women that she found with the Impressionists, even if women remained the minority there." So I'll now take you to the next slide where we can see an incredible work by Morisot, which features in French Impressionism. So by 1876, just 2 years after Morisot's debut in the Impressionists' independent exhibitions, critics began to remark on her distinctive painting style, which, as you can see, was characterized by a lack of finish. Many of Morisot's canvases are lightly worked, with a minimum of lines used to depict the subject. This is demonstrated here in White Flowers in a Bowl, which was created by the artist in 1885. As we can see, this work has a lightened palette consisting primarily of bright whites and blues. Importantly, the work also has a very lightly worked surface. So lightly worked, in fact, that large portions of the raw canvas ground can actually be seen around the work's perimeter. The feathery, quick brushworks on the surface of this work were typical of Morisot's experimental approach to painting, which he often applied to domestic scenes like this one, portraits, and natural landscapes. When considering the experimental way in which Morisot has painted her subject in White Flowers in a Bowl, it's important to cast our minds back to her socioeconomic status. She was a wealthy woman and therefore did not rely on the sale of her paintings in order to make a living. In this way, she had the freedom to experiment in her paintings, which is clearly evidenced by this canvas. So on the next slide, we will see an 1889 canvas by Morisot, Embroidery, which, while it is not in French Impressionism or the MFA's collection, is an equally significant work to discuss during this lecture, given that the work recently entered the NGV's permanent collection. Beyond being the first work by a woman impressionist in the NGV's collection, the first painting, I should say, like White Flowers in a Bowl, this painting captures many of the painterly qualities that characterize Morisot's distinct and innovative artistic approach. In Embroidery, Morisot depicts a familiar interior scene within her own home using her daughter Julie and niece Alice as models as they sew. Morisot has reinvented the familiar domestic portrait format by introducing both light and movement into the scene. While this painting is more resolved than white flowers in a bowl, it is still distinguished by its sketch-like appearance. Beyond capturing an impression, these qualities of Morisot's painting technique animate the domestic scene before our eyes. We can also glimpse around the edges of the painting areas where the canvas is very lightly worked, depicting only a few rush dabs and strokes. Together, these remarkable canvases demonstrate Morisot's commitment to the hallmarks of Impressionism. So I will now move on to Mary Cassatt, who was the only American member of the French Impressionist circle. So Cassatt was born in Pennsylvania in 1844. In her early years, Cassatt, with her family, lived in France and Germany, but eventually returned to the US. And from 1860 to 1862, she commenced her formal training at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts under relatively liberal conditions that permitted women to undertake a traditional art education. As was the case for Morisot, this more liberal climate afforded by Cassatt's geographical location did not preclude her from being subject to the sexism many women faced during this period. In fact, her own father, Robert S. Cassatt, once offered the following remark about Cassatt's plans to become an artist. He said, and I quote, "I would almost rather see you dead." Following her studies in Pennsylvania, Cassatt sought further training abroad and traveled with her mother to France in 1865. When she arrived, she received private lessons from the academic painter Jean-Léon Gérôme, who encouraged Cassatt to visit the Louvre and copy from the works of the old masters. 3 years after her arrival in Paris, one of Cassatt's paintings, The Mandolin Player, was accepted into the 1868 Salon. In 1870, due to the eruption of the Franco-Prussian War, Cassatt briefly returned to Philadelphia, but she returned to Paris a year later and spent several years traveling, studying and creating art throughout Europe. And from 1874 onwards, Cassatt began to regularly exhibit work in the annual Salon exhibitions in Paris. Starting in 1875, the Impressionist group began to invite Cassatt to exhibit with them, but it was not until 1879 that she accepted an invitation extended by Edgar Degas, who became a friend, collaborator, and mentor to Cassatt. From then on, her work featured in 4 in the series of 8 Impressionist exhibitions that took place in Paris. Despite starting out as somewhat of an outsider by virtue of her nationality, Cassatt became a central member of the Impressionist circle. Would you go to the next slide, please, Felicity? So, beyond her involvement with the Impressionists, Cassatt also fostered close artistic connections throughout her career, most notably with Degas. The two artists shared a fascination with many aspects of the quote-unquote New World in Paris, brought about by rapid urbanization, industrialization, and other forces associated with the Haussianization of the city. These significant renovations to the city's infrastructure were commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and were carried out by Georges Eugene Haussmann between 1853 and 1870. This period of transformation saw the old Paris virtually removed and replaced with the distinctive infrastructure that we associate with the city today. The two artists captured some of the socio-political changes brought about by the Haussmannization of Paris in the prints that they produced with Camille Pissarro for a planned journal called Day and Night. The 3 artists, particularly Degas, were fascinated by the processes involved in making prints and produced, to quote Degas, countless experiments. Now, for reasons that are not fully known, this journal never came to fruition. However, the brilliant quote from Cassatt's mother that I've included on this slide provides some possible insight. She said, and I quote, "As usual with Degas, when the time arrived to appear, he wasn't ready. So that journal, which might have been a great success, has not yet appeared. Degas is never ready for anything. However, these prints remain, which occupy an entire gallery in French Impressionism. The prints in this section of the exhibition, which is titled Innovative Printmaking, are regarded as some of the most experimental prints of the 19th century. And this is really due to the artists combining various printmaking techniques simultaneously and working their plates through multiple states in order to produce the complex and nuanced compositions that you can see on display. Visitors to French Impressionism really have the opportunity to see the process involved in making these works unfold before their eyes. Moving between lightness and darkness and other pictorial effects, the artist sought to render through the use of various printmaking processes. I will focus on the prints produced by Cassatt and Degas, as they demonstrate the artist's shared interest in the rapid urbanization of the nation's capital in the second half of the 19th century. So on this next slide, we can see 3 prints by Degas, which feature in French Impressionism and depict Cassatt and her sister Lydia in various galleries at the Louvre in Paris. Visiting the Louvre was a part of the formal training process for many artists, whose teachers encouraged them to visit the museum and learn from the greats. One of my favorite things about these prints by Degas is that despite being indoors, he has still found a way to represent the atmosphere of the space. For example, in the central print on this slide, we can see how he has paid close attention to capturing the complex play of reflections of light cast from the windows in the Louvre's galleries. We can also see that Degas was heavily influenced by developments in Japanese art. For example, in the long vertical print on this slide, Degas has framed the women in quite an unconventional manner. This cropping and vertical format demonstrates the influence of Japanese pillar prints on Degas' work. Now on this next slide, we'll see the series of prints by Cassatt that feature in French Impressionism, which depict social and technological advancements that fascinated her, namely contemporary entertainments and the advent of artificial light. We can see that a young woman is depicted in a brightly lit theatre box. The woman was likely modelled by her sister Lydia. Like Degas, Cassatt has found a way to capture the hazy atmosphere around the young woman and the play of light across her shoulders, hair, and face. I've also included an image of an earlier 1879 painting by Cassatt, which records the same subject. When looking at the prints and the painting side by side, we can see how, through her innovative use of various printmaking techniques, Cassatt managed to transfer the experimental painting techniques she used to create the slightly earlier painting, pictured at the bottom right of this slide, which is now in the permanent collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, across to the printed medium. In addition to these prints by Cassatt, a painting produced by the artist around 1896 also features in this exhibition. You can see this artwork on the next slide, which is titled Ellen Mary in a White Coat. So, in addition to the social, cultural, and technological advancements captured in her depictions of urban scenes, Cassatt was also interested in rendering domestic scenes and portraits, including this painting of one of her youngest and probably one of her smallest sitters, her niece, Ellen Mary. Now, Ellen Mary was a favoured subject for Cassatt and appears in several of her works, as you can see in the sketch-like composition depicting the child 3 years on, which is pictured on the right of this slide, which is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The warmth and naturalness that characterizes many of Cassatt's intimate domestic scenes and images of family is captured in this early portrayal of the artist's niece. We can see that Ellen Mary is dressed in a stiff white coat with a large bonnet and bow of the same color. She appears to be waiting patiently for an outdoor adventure. One of my favorite parts of this work is actually Ellen Mary's feet, which have only been quickly sketched in by Cassatt, likely because her subject may have gotten distracted and moved from her seat, or perhaps Cassatt was satisfied with the level of detail she had captured elsewhere in the painting. Regardless of her intention, this particular detail in Ellen Mary in a white coat speaks to the Impressionists' dedication to capturing the momentary across all subject matter. So I would like to spend the final portion of this lecture discussing one of the external forces that impacted on Morisot, Cassatt, and their artistic practice. I think it is important to acknowledge the many limitations that these women worked against throughout their lives to continuously create art. So Morisot and Cassatt's careers actually did not intersect until the 1880s. In 1881, Morisot and Cassatt exhibited together for the first time in the 6th Impressionist exhibition. And a decade on, the two women were once again brought together, this time by critics and art world conservatives who began to compare the two on quite reductive grounds, namely their gender. Despite being members of a relatively liberal artistic circle, the women could not escape from the prejudices surrounding quote-unquote feminine art. Shortly after Morisot began exhibiting with the Impressionists in 1876, her works began to be heralded among critics of the time as appropriately feminine, whereas Cassatt was described as, and I quote, that masculine American. Such discussions of Morisot's and Cassatt's work and practice with reference to their gender, persisted and intensified in the 1890s. This shift can be linked to a broader, particularly peculiar categorization of Impressionism that emerged during this period. Reflecting the broader scientific and cultural analyses of women in the late 19th century, in the early 1890s, critics began to describe Impressionism as quote-unquote feminine, and therefore lesser than traditional so-called masculine modes of artistic production in an attempt to discredit the movement. Now, the irony of feminizing Impressionism, I think, is perfectly demonstrated by the contrasting sentiments offered on this slide. Of Impressionism, Theodor de Weiser, a critic and writer active in the late 19th century, said, and I quote, "Only a woman has the right to rigorously practice the Impressionist system. She alone can limit her effort to the translation of impressions." 19th century critic and art historian Claude Roger Marx made a more explicit connection between Impressionism and the perceived mental weaknesses of women. He said, and I quote, "The term Impressionism itself announces a manner of observation and notation which is well suited to the hypersensitivity and nervousness of women." Far more recently, the contemporary curator and academic and the curator of women artists in Paris, 1850 to 1900, Laurence Madeleine, offered the following rebuttal to assessments such as those offered by Weiser and Marx. She said, and I quote, "This argument reveals a crucial paradox. Women are supposedly inferior to men. They understand nothing or very little about matters of art, yet they represent a threat." So now I will provide a little bit more contextual information about how this criticism against the Impressionist movement came to fruition in the 1890s. So in 19th century France, a clear distinction was made between masculinity and femininity in social discourse as well as in art criticism. It was thought that men possessed the qualities of rationality and the ability to engage in abstract thought, allowing them to understand and exercise all realms of knowledge, from science to the arts. Women, on the other hand, were believed to be at the mercy of their emotions and impulses. It was thought that they lacked the ability to deal with the superior mental functions possessed by men. Women's perceived mental weakness was the subject of frequent debate in science and culture more broadly. So-called masculine superiority was defended by scientists like Gustave Le Bon and Henri de Varigny. For example, in his entry for Femi in the Great Encyclopedia, which was a general medical reference book published in 1892, de Varigny attributes a woman's quote-unquote intellectual inferiority to alleged physiological and anatomical differences between women and men. He claimed that the woman's brain is, and I quote, less wrinkled, its convolutions less beautiful, less ample than the man's brain. The delineation between allegedly feminine and masculine virtues was also reflected in the art world. Artworks were considered an integral expression of one's gender. The academic Tamar Garb has explained that, and I quote, certain kinds of mark making were regarded as masculine and others as feminine. This is reflected in reviews by critics of the time, which often differentiate between intrinsically feminine and masculine artistic qualities. Drawing and design, with their connotations of rational planning and compositional organization, were considered masculine assets. Color, on the other hand, was associated with sentimentality, expression, and flux, all supposedly feminine attributes. Additionally, it was believed that women, believed to be lacking the mental functionality required to engage in abstract thought and other superior masculine modes of artistic production, were only capable of recording their observations and impressions. It is on these grounds that Impressionism was categorized as feminine throughout the final decade of the 19th century. The Impressionists' aim to record the ephemeral and the modern was regarded by critics of the time as a misguided rejection of all general and underlying truths. These truths encompass the traditional artistic activities prized by academic painters and artistic conservatives, design, drawing, and other quote-unquote masculine activities requiring deep concentration and intellectual engagement. The hallmarks of Impressionism, which include quick and broken brushwork, a lightened palette, and modern subjects, were considered by many of the movement's opponents to be impulsive and thoughtless. It is on these grounds that critics began to describe Impressionism as a feminine style in the 1890s. Amid this categorization of Impressionism as feminine, Morisot took center stage. As I mentioned earlier, Morisot's canvases are lightly worked, with a minimum of lines used to depict the subject. The sketched appearance of Morisot's paintings was quickly linked to what Tamar Garb has described as her primordial feminine weakness. This is demonstrated by the various reflections on Morisot's work offered by critics of the time, a few of which we can see on the next slide, which explicitly drew links between her artistic practice and her gender. In 1880, Paul de Hare said of Berthe Morisot's painting technique, "With this talent, why does she not take the trouble to finish? Morisot is a woman and is therefore capricious. Unfortunately, she is like Eve who bites the apple and then gives up on it too soon. Too bad, since she bites it so well." Critic Paul Valéry attributed the fragmentary nature of Morisot's canvases to her supposed innate feminine ability to work intuitively and outside of a learned set of rules. He said, and I quote, "The peculiarity of Berthe Morisot was to live her painting and to live her life as if the interchange between seeing and rendering, between light and her creative will, were to her a natural function, a necessary part of her daily life. She allowed no ideology or spirit of any system to diminish the spontaneity of her art." Now, ironically, this essentialization of Morisot's art and practice was intended by such critics as Valéry to be complimentary and favorable, when in fact it is extremely reductive. Such reviews of Morisot's artistic process are actually at odds with her own reflections on the difficulties that she experienced while attempting to capture the momentary in her paintings. In a letter to Monet, dated 14th of March, 1888, Morisot described being, and I quote, "engaged in a pitched battle with her canvases, demonstrating her conscious engagement with Impressionism." Despite such inconsistencies between the words of the critics and Morisot's own views on her working methods, reviews linking her gender to her artistic practice prevailed. Cassatt, on the other hand, was considered quote-unquote masculine when compared to the quote-unquote feminine Morisot. Several contemporary critics have argued that such categorizations of Cassatt were based on her being perceived as a better draftsperson and because she was an American and therefore embodied the independent nature of her people. Such assessments of Cassatt were also rooted in her marital status. Cassatt was a wealthy, unmarried woman. Unlike Morisot, Cassatt's mode of living and making art did not align with the myth of a well-adjusted, acceptable femininity. By discrediting Impressionism and its practitioners, Morisot, Cassatt, and several of their male counterparts as feminine and therefore inconsequential, critics and other traditionalists within the art world aimed to minimize the impact of the movement, but they were too late. The Impressionists had already turned away from the past and toward modern life. As a result, Impressionism became the first in a string of avant-garde art movements that revolutionized the art world throughout the 20th century. According to the curator and author Sidsel Maria Sunagol, the Impressionists had, and I quote, stepped out of the ivory tower's idealizing picture, had stepped out of the ivory tower's idealizing picture world and had gotten busy breaking down the dividing line between painting and modernity. That is to say, between art and life as it was being lived. So I'll now move on to the final slide in my presentation. So while the women of French Impressionism constituted a relatively small minority within the larger group involved, and despite the miscategorization of their work and their identity by many prominent critics and art world conservatives of the time, their collective achievements were extraordinary. Joining the Impressionist circle undeniably afforded Morisot and Cassatt a degree of artistic freedom and independence from the institutional limitations imposed upon women in the second half of the 19th century. Increasingly, their centrality to the Impressionist movement is being recognized and written into art history by contemporary curators and art historians. Morisot and Cassatt persisted in making many of the most innovative and experimental works of the 20th century. I would also like to briefly acknowledge Cassatt's crucial role as an advisor to several prominent art collectors, which ultimately benefited major public galleries and museums throughout the US. For example, Cassatt accompanied American collectors Mr. and Mrs. H.O. Havemeyer on a collecting trip in Europe, during which she actively encouraged them to purchase works by several of the Impressionists. Today, the Havemeyer collection, which Cassatt was instrumental in shaping, is a celebrated part of the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In this way, Cassatt's influence on Impressionism's place within the history books extends well beyond the surface of the canvas and onto our gallery walls. So with that, I hope that you have all enjoyed this lecture and that I have been able to provide some insight into the remarkable lives and artistic practices of two central members of the Impressionist circle. I thought I would end with two quotes from Morisot and Cassatt, which I think speak perfectly to the courage and the tenacity that characterized the way these women lived and created art. In 1877, after being asked by Degas to join the Impressionists, Cassatt offered the following reflection. She said, and I quote, "At last, I could work with absolute independence without considering the opinion of a jury. I hated conventional art. I began to live." And Morisot said the following about her approach to painting. "To catch the fleeting moment, anything, however small, a smile, a flower, a fruit, is an ambition." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was just absolutely fascinating to hear more about the lives of Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's joined us today. So great to have you here with us virtually. For anyone who pre-registered, we will have a survey email to send out to you. We'd love to hear about your experience today. Otherwise, it would be great if we could see you at another one of our virtual programs. Up next, we have Changing Nature of Power, which is going to be another absolutely fascinating lecture looking at our current French Impressionism in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston exhibition. Thank you so much.